Welcome back to the deep dive. Wow, you've given us quite the challenge today, covering, what, 35,000 years of history?
Yeah, just a small slice. We're
Yeah.
jumping into the really deep history of the Americas from about 33,000 BCE right up to 1680 CE.
Okay, so this is a huge sweep. Our mission then, I guess, is to make sense of these enormous changes, geological, social, economic, that really set the stage for, well, everything that came after.
Exactly. It's about understanding the foundations and the key moments before that big collision of worlds really happens.
Right, and we have to start way, way back, like geology back, thinking about North America itself taking shape. It's easy to forget that 225 million years ago, it was all just one big landmass, Pangaea.
It really
Yeah.
puts things in perspective, doesn't it? And you
Okay.
see that deep time reflected in the continent itself, the Appalachians,
Mhm.
ancient, formed maybe 480 million years ago.
Whoa.
Yeah, compare that to the Rockies. They're practically teenagers, geologically speaking, only about 70 million years old. It's just a different time scale.
And the event that really shaped the human story here was the Ice Age, right?
Absolutely crucial. The last big one started around 2.6 million years ago. Imagine glaciers, maybe 2 miles thick in places, just grinding across the land.
Hard to picture.
Totally. And when they finally retreated, maybe 10,000 years ago, they left behind a completely reshaped landscape. That's how we got the Great Lakes.
Okay.
And huge ancient lakes, too, like Lake Bonneville. The Great Salt Lake is just a little puddle left over from that.
But the really key thing for people arriving was the land bridge.
The land bridge, yeah, Beringia. Because the glaciers locked up so much water, sea levels dropped, and this land connection popped up between Eurasia and North America.
Connecting Siberia and Alaska.
Precisely. And that's how the first Americans got here.
Yeah.
Small groups of nomadic hunters, probably following herds of mammoths and bison, just walked across. We think this was happening maybe 15,000 to 16,000 years ago.
And then the ice melts, the sea levels rise back up.
And around 10,000 years ago, that bridge disappears underwater again. So these populations were then effectively cut off from the rest of the world for, well, millennia.
Wow. And in that isolation, they didn't just survive, they thrived. By 1492, when Columbus shows up, we're talking, what, maybe 54 million people across North and South America?
That's the estimate, yeah. An incredible diversity, thousands of languages, countless different cultures and societies.
So what allowed some of those societies to become these huge, complex empires we read about?
One word, really,
Hmm.
maize, corn. It starts as this kind of wild grass down in highland Mexico around 5000 BCE,
Yeah.
but people figured out how to cultivate it and improve it.
And it becomes the absolute staple food.
The staff of life, exactly. It's reliable, high in calories.
Yeah.
Once you have that kind of stable food source, you can have surpluses.
Which means not everyone has to farm all the time. You get specialization.
Precisely. And that's the foundation for complex centralized states. Think of the Incas in Peru,
Mm.
the Maya in Central America, and of course the Aztecs in Mexico.
Huge populations there, right?
Yeah.
Mexico might have had 20 million people.
Yeah, incredible density, building massive cities like Tenochtitlan, intricate trade routes, and all this without, large draft animals like horses or oxen or even the wheel for transport. Really remarkable.
Okay, so those are the big empires in Mesoamerica and South America. But what about North America, north of Mexico? It seems like it was more varied there.
Hugely varied. People adapted brilliantly to all sorts of different environments. In the Southwest, for instance, you get the Pueblo people,
The cliff dwellers.
some of them, yeah, or living in multi-storied villages made of adobe. And the key there was irrigation. They developed these really complex systems to grow corn in arid lands, starting way back, maybe 2000 BCE.
But in other dry areas like the Great Basin or the plains, corn wasn't really an option.
Not so much, or at least not reliably. So the societies tended to be more mobile, focusing on hunting, especially bison on the plains or gathering, different strategies for different places.
And then you go east, towards the Mississippi Valley, the Atlantic coast.
Now you're talking about some really large settled communities. Mixed economies, farming, hunting, fishing, and some very sophisticated cultures.
Yeah.
We absolutely have to talk about the mound builders.
Like Cahokia, near modern St. Louis.
Exactly. Cahokia was incredible. At its peak, maybe 25,000 people living there, it had this enormous central mound, 100 feet high, just a massive urban center flourishing around, say, 1100 CE.
Wow. And they farmed.
Oh, yeah. They were part of that Mississippian culture. And their agricultural techniques, especially three-sister farming, eventually spread throughout the East.
Right, the corn, beans, and squash grown together. That's pretty clever ecologically.
It really is. The corn stalks provide poles for the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, helping the corn, and the squash leaves shade the ground, keeping moisture in and weeds down.
A perfect system.
Pretty much. It supported really dense populations, especially in the southeast, among groups like the Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee.
And moving further north into the northeast, you get the Iroquois Confederacy.
The Haudenosaunee, yeah. A really fascinating example of political organization. According to their traditions, inspired by the leader Hiawatha, 5 tribes came together.
The Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas.
Right. They formed this powerful league, the Iroquois Confederacy, very effective militarily and politically. They were a major force to be reckoned with, even for the Europeans later on. And they had a really interesting social structure, too.
They were matrilineal, wasn't that it?
Yes, matrilineal, that's key. It means family lineage, inheritance, property, it all passed down to the female side. Women held a lot of social and political clout. They often chose the sachems, the chiefs, who sat on the tribal council.
So the big takeaway here is that North America before 1492 was far from empty or static. These were dynamic societies, actively shaping their world.
Absolutely. They weren't just passively waiting. They managed forests with controlled burns, creating those park-like woodlands the first Europeans described. They had vast trade networks. They were changing and adapting all the time.
Okay, so now we need to bring Europe into the picture.
Right.
We know the Vikings, the Norse, made it over around 1000 CE, landed somewhere they called Vinland, but it didn't stick. Why not?
Good question. Basically, they lacked the critical support system. There wasn't a strong, unified kingdom backing them with resources, population, and crucially, a strong economic motive for large-scale settlement. It was more of a temporary outpost that faded away.
So what created that motive later on? What drove Europeans to eventually cross the Atlantic in force?
Well, a lot of it goes back to the Crusades.
Interesting. How so?
The Crusades, those wars from the 11th to 14th centuries to reclaim the Holy Land, they ultimately failed in that goal. But they exposed Europeans, particularly the elite, to all sorts of desirable goods from Asia,
Silks, perfumes, draperies.
and especially spices.
Yeah.
Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and sugar, which was considered a spice back then. Hugely valuable, used for flavoring, preserving food, even medicine. Europeans got hooked.
Okay, so they want this stuff. What's the problem?
The price. Getting those goods from Asia to Europe was incredibly expensive. It involved long, dangerous overland routes, passing through many hands, especially Muslim traders in the Eastern Mediterranean who controlled the trade hubs.
Ah, the middlemen taking their cut at every step.
Exactly. So merchants and the rulers of these newly consolidating European kingdoms like Portugal and Spain were desperate to find a cheaper way, a direct sea route to Asia, bypassing the Italians and the Muslims.
That makes sense. And that required better ships, better navigation.
Right. Technology played a role. The printing press helped spread knowledge, maps became more available. The mariner's compass, adapted from the Arabs, was essential. But the real game changer in ship design was the caravel.
The caravel, what was special about it?
It could sail better against the wind. Earlier European ships with square sails were fine for sailing with the wind in the Mediterranean, but not for the tricky winds and currents of the Atlantic, especially for sailing back up the coast of Africa. The caravel's triangular sails made that possible.
So who takes the lead with this new tech?
Portugal. They were unified earlier than Spain and geographically positioned to explore the Atlantic. Starting around 1450, Portuguese sailors began methodically exploring down the West African coast.
And this is where they encountered the African slave trade.
They tapped into an existing slave trade run by Africans and Arabs, but then they dramatically expanded it and systematized it for a new purpose.
Which was?
Sugar plantations. On islands off the African coast, Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé the Portuguese, set up large-scale farms to grow sugarcane, a hugely profitable crop.
And they needed labor for these tough, dangerous plantations.
Massive amounts of labor, and they turned to Africa. They started forcibly transporting tens of thousands of Africans to work these sugar islands. We're talking maybe 40,000 in the last half of the 15th century alone. This is the origin of the Atlantic plantation system.
So large-scale commercial farming, single cash crop, dependent on brutal, forced labor. That's the model they perfected before Columbus even sailed.
Precisely. It's a grim blueprint for what would later happen in the Americas.
Meanwhile, back in Spain, things are heating up there too, right?
Big time. You get the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile uniting the kingdom. And then the big one, 1492.
Right.
Not only does Columbus sail, but Spain finally completes the Reconquista.
The centuries-long fight to push the Muslim Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula Granada, the last stronghold, falls.
Right. So now you have a unified, militarily strong, religiously zealous Spain. They see Portugal getting rich from the African route to the east, but that route is basically Portugal's monopoly. Spain needs another way.
They need to go west.
Exactly. And along comes this persistent Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus, with his idea of reaching the East Indies by sailing directly west across the Atlantic.
And Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh off their victory, decide to gamble on him.
They do. And the rest, as they say, is history. Though, as you pointed out, Columbus was kind of a successful failure.
He never found a direct route to Asia. He found something else entirely.
2 whole continents. But he went to his grave convinced he'd reach the outskirts of the East Indies. That's why he called the people he met Indians. A mistake that stuck, amazingly.
But his voyages, successful or not in their aim, fundamentally changed the world. They kicked off this whole new global system.
Instantly.
Yeah.
You suddenly have this interdependent system emerging. Europe provided the capital, the markets, the technology.
Africa providing the labor, tragically, based on that Portuguese plantation model.
And the New World providing the raw materials, land, forests, and especially those precious metals, gold and silver, plus fertile soil, perfect for growing things like sugarcane. And this whole interaction becomes known as the Columbian Exchange.
Right, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technology, ideas between the old world and the new. Let's break that down. What came from the Americas to Europe?
Some incredibly important things that revolutionized European life. Tobacco, of course, but also maize, beans, tomatoes, and crucially, the potato.
The potato seems so humble.
But it was a game changer. Easy to grow, packed with calories. It became a staple food for the poor across Europe, especially Ireland, and fueled a massive population boom over the next couple of centuries.
Okay, so Europe gets potatoes, corn, tomatoes. What goes the other way, from the old world to the new?
Well, livestock was huge. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and horses.
Horses must have had a massive impact on native cultures, especially on the plains.
Transformative. Within a few generations, plains groups like the Comanche, Apache, Sioux became incredibly skilled horse-mounted hunters and warriors. It totally changed their way of life. The Old World also brought crops like wheat, rice, and sugarcane.
There it is again, sugar, driving that demand for labor.
Absolutely. Sugar cultivation explodes in the Caribbean and Brazil, and with it, the demand for enslaved Africans skyrockets.
But the most devastating part of the Columbian Exchange wasn't intentional, was it?
No, it was disease, microbes, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, yellow fever, malaria. Europeans carried these diseases, often without even knowing it.
And Native Americans, because they'd been isolated for 15,000 years.
They had no built-up immunity, none. The impact was catastrophic. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
What are the numbers?
The estimates are grim. We're talking a mortality rate of perhaps 90% across the Americas in the century or two after contact. 90%.
90.
It's demographic collapse on an unimaginable scale. Disease often wiped out entire communities before Europeans even arrived there physically. Think about Hispaniola, where Columbus first landed. The Taino population might have been around 1 million people. 50 years later, maybe 200.
Just gone.
Essentially wiped out by disease and brutal exploitation. The microbes were the most effective conquerors.
So after this initial shockwave, Spain moves quickly to solidify its claims.
Yes. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas with Portugal. Basically, the Pope draws a line down the map, giving Spain the bulk of the Americas, while Portugal gets Brazil and Africa.
And Spain starts using the Caribbean islands, like Hispaniola and Cuba, as bases to launch further conquests on the mainland.
Right, and they need to organize labor there. This leads to the encomienda system.
Okay, what was that exactly?
Officially, the Spanish crown gave, or commended, native people to certain colonists. In return, the colonists were supposed to Christianize them.
But in reality...
In reality, it was thinly veiled slavery. Colonists forced natives to work often brutally on plantations or in mines, extracting wealth for themselves and the Spanish crown. He was incredibly harsh. Even some Spaniards at the time, like the Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, were horrified and called it a moral pestilence.
And this system provides the manpower and resources for the big mainland conquests.
It does. First up is Hernán Cortés, setting off from Cuba in 1519 towards Mexico.
Targeting the Aztec Empire.
Right. Cortés was ambitious, ruthless, and pretty clever. He had a huge advantage with his horses and firearms, but his real key was exploiting internal divisions.
He found allies among other native groups who hated the Aztecs.
Exactly. He had invaluable help from interpreters, a Spanish castaway he found, and especially a Nahua woman named Malinche, later baptized as Doña Marina. She spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and helped Cortés forge alliances with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who joined him against the Aztec ruler, Moctezuma.
So Moctezuma lets them into the capital, Tenochtitlan.
Initially, yes. It's complex. Maybe he thought Cortés was a god, or maybe he's just being cautious.
Hmm.
But relations quickly soured, especially over the Spanish hunger for gold. There was fighting. The Spanish were driven out during the Noches, the Sad Night in 1520, with heavy losses.
But Cortés comes back.
He does. He besieges the city. And crucially, a smallpox epidemic breaks out within Tenochtitlan, carried by the Spanish, which devastates the Aztec defenders who have no immunity.
So disease helps again.
Massively. Tenochtitlan finally falls in 1521, a staggering loss of life.
Hmm.
Mexico's native population just plummeted from maybe 20 million down to 2 million in less than 100 years due to conquest and disease.
And then comes Pizarro in South America.
Francisco Pizarro, yeah. Even more ruthless, perhaps. In 1532, with just a small force, he manages to capture the Inca ruler Atahualpa in Peru, ransom him for a room full of gold, and then kill him anyway. He crushes the vast Inca empire.
And the result is this unbelievable flood of gold and especially silver pouring out of the Andes back to Spain.
Yes, particularly from the massive silver mines at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. This flood of New World silver had huge consequences back in Europe.
It causes inflation.
Massive inflation. It's called the price revolution. Consumer costs might have jumped 500% over a century, but all that silver also provided the capital that really fueled the growth of international trade and banking, basically helping to bankroll the development of capitalism.
It's amazing how connected it all is. Now, one thing mentioned is the mixing of cultures, because not many Spanish women came over early on.
Right, so Spanish conquerors and colonists frequently intermarried or had children with native women. This created a whole new population group, the mestizos.
People of mixed European and indigenous ancestry.
Exactly. They became a really significant part of the social and cultural landscape, kind of bridge between the old world and the new, especially in Mexico and South America.
Okay, so after conquering the big empires, Spain keeps pushing north, still looking for gold, right?
Still hoping for another Mexico or Peru. You get explorers like Ponce de Leon in Florida looking for gold, maybe the Fountain of Youth. Doesn't find either.
Then Coronado out west.
Francisco Coronado, yeah, 1540-42, wanders all over Arizona, New Mexico, even into Kansas. He finds the Grand Canyon, sees huge herds of buffalo, but no gold cities, just pueblo villages.
And De Soto in the southeast.
Hernando de Soto, 1539-42. A brutal expedition through Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, discovers the Mississippi River, but again finds mostly resistance and disease, not gold. He dies on the journey.
So the dreams of easy riches in North America aren't panning out. But Spain still wants to hold the territory.
Definitely, especially to block rivals, like the French who were sniffing around Florida. That's why they established St. Augustine, Florida in 1565.
Which is the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the future U.S., right?
That's the one. More about defense than riches at that point. But they did push into the southwest more seriously, into New Mexico.
Led by Don Juan de Oñate in 1598.
Yes. And his expedition was incredibly harsh towards the Pueblo people. After a revolt at Acoma Pueblo in 1599, Oñate's forces stormed the Pueblo, killed hundreds, and then...
This is grim.
It is. They sentenced every surviving man over 25 to have one foot cut off. Just brutal subjugation. They founded Santa Fe as the capital in 1609, and the main Spanish focus shifted to converting the Pueblos to Catholicism, often forcibly suppressing native religions.
Which, understandably, leads to resentment.
Massive resentment. It builds for decades, fueled by drought, famine, and the missionaries' attacks on their traditional ceremonies and beliefs. And it finally explodes in 1680.
The Pueblo Revolt.
Led by a Pueblo religious leader named Pope. It was incredibly well coordinated. Pueblo fighters across New Mexico rose up simultaneously. They destroyed every Catholic church, killed hundreds of Spanish priests and settlers, and drove the remaining Spaniards completely out of New Mexico, all the way down to El Paso.
Wow. So they actually won.
They did. They took back Santa Fe. And symbolically, they built a kiva, their own sacred ceremonial chamber, right on the main plaza where the Spanish government buildings had been. It was a powerful statement of cultural resurgence.
How long did they hold the Spanish off?
For nearly half a century, actually. The Spanish didn't fully reconquer New Mexico until the 1690s. It stands out as one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history.
A really important counter-narrative to just Spanish dominance.
Absolutely. And it highlights the resilience of native cultures. Now, it's easy to focus on the Black Legend, the idea that the Spanish only brought cruelty, disease, and exploitation. And there was plenty of that, no question.
But it's more complicated.
It is. Compared to, say, the later English approach, the Spanish, for all their brutality, were also genuine empire builders in a different sense. They incorporated indigenous populations into their society, albeit usually at the bottom. They intermarried, creating the mestizo culture. Their laws, religion, language deeply shaped Latin America in a way that was quite different from the more segregated colonies the English would establish later.
So laying foundations even through conquest.
Right, they weren't just extracting resources, they were building a new, blended, albeit deeply unequal, society.
Okay, that's a massive journey we've taken. From Pangaea and the Ice Age, through the rise of complex native societies powered by maize.
To the European drive for Asian spices, fueled by the Crusades and enabled by the Caravel.
Leading to Columbus, the devastating Columbian exchange, especially disease.
And finally, the Spanish conquest of vast empires, the flood of silver fueling early capitalism, the encomienda system, the creation of mestizo populations, and that crucial moment of native resistance with the Pueblo Revolt in 1680.
It really sets the stage for everything that follows in North America.
It absolutely does. The patterns established here, the interactions, the conflicts, the exchanges, they echo for centuries.
So, a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. How might that successful Pueblo Revolt in 1680, that temporary expulsion of the Spanish, have actually altered Spain's long-term strategy in North America? Did it make them perhaps more cautious, maybe slightly more accommodating in some ways later on, compared to if they'd just rolled over the Pueblos easily? How did that resistance shape the future?
Something definitely worth pondering. It shows resistance could and did change the course of events.
Indeed. Well, thank you for diving deep with us today into these foundational chapters.
My pleasure. It's crucial history to understand.
We'll talk to you next time on The Deep Dive.